Everybody knows the first two brothers, Cain and Abel. One kills the other in a field, and it becomes the first murder, the first grave, the story every Sunday school teaches. And then, if you remember anything at all about what came next, you remember a third name, dropped in almost as an afterthought. Seth, the replacement son, the one who takes Abel's place and then quietly disappears from the story you were told. But here is what nobody tells you about that third son. You are descended from him. Every single person alive on the earth right now traces back through Seth, not through Cain, not through Abel, but through the forgotten brother the retellings barely mention. And the Bible spends a whole chapter, 10 generations long, walking his family tree down to Noah and the flood. Cain gets a murder, Abel gets a grave, Seth gets the entire human race, and almost nobody can tell you a single thing about him. And the moment you actually stop on his story, the same impossible question that haunts Cain comes straight back around, except this time nobody ever asks it. Seth grew up. Seth married. Seth had a son named Enosh, and then sons and daughters for 800 years. So here is the question this whole video turns on. Where did Seth's wife come from, when the only people on the entire planet were his own parents and whatever siblings survived the first murder? Who exactly did the third son of Adam marry? And why does a book that names his wife nowhere go to such trouble to trace every man who came after her? Because when you follow Seth instead of skipping him, you find that the forgotten son is hiding some of the strangest material in the entire Bible. A line that runs, name by name, all the way to Jesus. A set of eerie twin names shared with the family of a murderer. A reason God may have sent the flood that lands squarely on Seth's descendants. And a bizarre afterlife where, thousands of years later, whole religions were built on the name of a man you were taught to forget. Let's get into it. To understand Seth, you have to understand the exact moment he is born into, because it is one of the most devastated moments in the whole book. Think about where Adam and Eve are when Seth arrives. They have already lost paradise. They have been driven out of the garden, cut off from the tree of life, told the ground itself will fight them. And then, out here in the hard world, they build a family, and it goes worse than the garden ever did. Their firstborn son, Cain, murders their second son, Abel, in cold blood in a field. In a single day, Eve loses both of her first two children. One is dead in the ground. The other is a marked man, an exile, sent away to wander the earth east of Eden. She is a mother who buried one boy and watched the other walk off into the wilderness with blood on his hands. The first family is not a happy beginning. It is a catastrophe. And it is right there, in the wreckage of that Genesis gives us Seth. Listen to how the verse reads. It says, Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and she called his name Seth. And then it gives us her reason, in her own voice, one of the rare moments Eve herself speaks in the Bible. She says, God has appointed me another seed, another offspring, in place of Abel, whom Cain slew. That is the whole meaning of the name. Seth in Hebrew sounds like the word shath, which means to set, to place, to appoint. Eve names her third son after the ache that produced him. He is the one God set in the empty place. He is the child who came to stand where a murdered brother used to be. Stay on that for a second, because it is a heavy thing to hang on a newborn. Seth is a replacement child. He is born into the shape of a loss. Before he ever does anything, before he takes a single breath of his own, his name already tells you he exists because someone else is gone. Every time Eve says his name, she is saying, "This is the one God gave me after the one I lost." He is comfort and grief in the same word. And that is the first clue to why the story treats him so strangely. Seth does not get his own dramatic beginning. He gets Abel's empty chair, and when the Bible circles back to tell Seth's birth a second time in the genealogy of chapter 5, it adds a detail chapter 4 left out and slips in something that should stop you cold. First, it tells you the timing. Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born, so more than a century passes between the murder in the field and this birth, a long, hard stretch of a grieving couple simply surviving in the world outside Eden. And then the verse says this: Adam became the father of a son in his own likeness, after his image, and he called him Seth. Now hold that next to the very first chapter of the Bible. Back in chapter 1, when God made the first human being, the text said, God made man in his own image, in the likeness of God. And now, when Adam fathers Seth, it reuses those exact words, but it moves them one generation down. God made Adam in God's image. Adam made Seth in Adam's image. The likeness of God, stamped on the first man, is being handed down, father to son. And the very first son the text names as carrying it is not the famous firstborn and not the murdered second son, but the forgotten third one, Seth. Whatever it means to be made in the image of God, Genesis quietly routes it through that overlooked child. But watch what the text does next, because it immediately signals that this quiet replacement son is the one who actually matters. The very next verse tells us Seth grew up and had a son of his own, a boy named Enosh, and then it drops a line that changes the whole tone of the story. It says that in the days of Enosh, in Seth's own household, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. After the murder, after the exile, after everything falls apart in Cain's branch of the family, it is in Seth's line that human beings first start to worship. The first prayer, the first calling out to God by name in the whole human story, happens on Seth's side of the family. And I have to be honest with you here, the way this channel always will be, because that verse is not as simple as it first looks, and the honesty is the whole point. The plain reading, the one most translations give you, is beautiful. It says worship began with Seth, that his family was where humanity first turned back toward God. But there is a very old Jewish reading that takes the exact same Hebrew and hears something much darker. The word translated began can be connected to a root that means to profane, to make common, and so some ancient rabbis read this verse almost upside down. They said this was the moment people began to profane the name of the Lord, the beginning of idolatry, when human beings first started calling created things by God's holy name. One verse. Two readings that are nearly opposites. The dawn of worship, or the dawn of idol worship, depending on how you hear a single word. But notice what even the darker reading agrees on. Both of them place the turning point right here, in Seth's generation. Whether it was the birth of true worship or the birth of false worship, everyone agrees that something spiritually enormous started in the household of the forgotten third son. The action of the human story, the part about God, moves out of Cain's line and into Seth's, and it never really moves back. Cain builds a city and invents the tools of civilization. But it is Seth's family where people first lift their heads and speak to heaven. So already, the forgotten son is not so forgettable. He is the child of comfort after murder. He is the branch where worship, or the argument about worship, begins. But the instant the text says Seth had sons and daughters, it walks straight into a problem it never once stops to explain. Because for Seth to have a son named Enosh, Seth needed a wife. And in a world with exactly one family in it, the question of where that wife came from is stranger and more loaded than almost anyone who reads this chapter ever lets themselves ask. Here is the question everyone aims at Cain, and almost nobody thinks to aim at Seth, even though it hits him just as hard. You have probably heard the famous objection to the book of Genesis. Where did Cain get his wife? Cain kills Abel. God sends him east to the land of Nod. And then the very next thing we read is that Cain knew his wife and she had a child. And skeptics have used that gap for centuries. If Adam and Eve were the first two people and their only named children so far are 3 sons, then where does a wife come from? There is nobody to marry. It is the single most common challenge thrown at these chapters. But watch what happens when you turn that same question on Seth, because it gets even sharper. Cain, at least, went away to a distant land, and a lot of people quietly imagine he found his wife out there somewhere, as if there were a village over the hill. It is wrong, but it is a comforting fuzz. Seth gets no such cover. Seth stays home. Seth is born into the one household on earth, raised by the first parents, and grows up and marries and has Enosh, all inside the original family, with no faraway land to hide the question in. So, who did he marry? When the only human beings alive are Adam, Eve, and their own children, there is only one possible answer, and the text refuses to say it out loud. Because the only answer the story allows, is that Seth married his sister, or possibly a niece, a daughter of one of his brothers. There was no one else. At the very beginning, the human race could only continue one way, by the children of Adam and Eve marrying one another. Cain married a sister or a niece. Seth married a sister or a niece. The Bible does not flinch at this, but it also does not spell it out. It just quietly assumes you understand that the first generation had no one to marry but each other. And I know exactly how that lands on a modern ear, because we recoil from it, and in our world, we absolutely should. So let me give you the 2 things the careful readers have always held on to, honestly, as what they are. First, the Bible's own law against a brother and sister marrying does not appear until the book of Leviticus, given to Moses on Mount Sinai, which in the story's own timeline is something like 2,500 years after Adam. The prohibition is real and serious, but the text presents it as a law spoken at a specific point in history, not a rule hanging over the first family, when there was literally no one outside the family for it to apply to. And second, some readers add a biological argument, which I will give you as exactly what it is, an interpretation and not a line of scripture. The idea is that the first human beings carried a genetically clean inheritance, without the accumulated copying errors that pile up in a family line over many generations, so that close marriage at the very start did not carry the dangers it carries now. You do not have to accept that, and many people do not. But notice that even the most literal readers are not hiding from the question. They are answering it directly. And the Bible does hand you the raw material for the answer in a verse people skip every single time because it reads like an accountant's note in the margin. In the middle of the genealogy, chapter 5, verse 4, it says that after Seth was born, Adam lived another 800 years, and that across those years he had other sons and daughters. Sons and daughters, not 3 boys on a hillside. A large and steadily growing family, brothers and sisters, whose names the text simply never records, spread across 8 centuries of Adam's life. Seth's wife is sitting right there inside that one phrase. She is one of those unnamed daughters, or a granddaughter born to one of them. The woman who seems to appear from nowhere was never a stranger from some hidden race of people. She was family, exactly like Seth, raised in the same first household under the same first sky. But here is where Seth's wife gets genuinely fascinating, because unlike a modern skeptic, the ancient readers who loved these chapters could not stand to leave her as a blank. They felt the missing name as strongly as you do. And so, in a book written more than 2,000 years ago, someone went back into the first family and did the one thing Genesis refused to do. They gave Seth's wife a name. The book is called the Book of Jubilees, an ancient Jewish text from roughly the 2nd century before Christ that retells Genesis and fills in its gaps with names and dates. And when Jubilees walks through the children of Adam and Eve, it does not leave the wives anonymous. It names them. It says that Seth married his sister, and it gives her a name. Her name, in Jubilees, is Azura. Azura. Say it, and you have already said something almost nobody ever says out loud. The name of the woman that half the human race, the surviving half, actually descends from. And this is not one lone, eccentric scribbling in a corner. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in caves near the Dead Sea, the Book of Jubilees turned up among them in more copies than some of the books that made it into the Standard Bible. The community that hid those scrolls treasured it, and to this day, one ancient branch of the Christian Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, still keeps Jubilees inside its Bible as full scripture. So for some believers, across thousands of years, Seth's wife was never a mystery at all. She had a name, and the name was Azura. Now I have to do the honest thing because it is the whole reason you can trust this channel. Jubilees is not in most people's Bibles, and its extra details, the names and the dates, are the work of a much later writer filling gaps, not eyewitness history from the dawn of the world. So I'm not going to stand here and tell you that Seth's wife was provably, historically named Azura. What I can tell you is that the name exists because the silence of Genesis was unbearable even to the ancient people closest to it. The ache you feel right now, wanting to know who this woman was, is not a modern itch. People have been trying to give Seth's wife back her name for over 2,000 years. And the fact that they had to reach outside the Bible to do it tells you something about how the Bible handles this whole family. It is about to name a lot of people. It is just not going to name the women. And the men it does name are hiding a pattern that once you see it, you cannot unsee. Here is where the story of the forgotten son turns into something almost eerie, and it is a pattern hiding in what looks like the most boring part of the Bible. After Cain kills Abel, the book of Genesis does something very deliberate. It gives you two family trees, back to back, and it wants you to compare them. In chapter 4, it traces the line of Cain, the murderer, the exile, down through several generations. And then in chapter 5, it stops, resets all the way back to Adam, and traces a completely separate line, the line of Seth, down through 10 generations to Noah. Two branches from the same root, one from the son who killed, one from the son who was appointed in the dead brother's place, and the book lays them out next to each other on purpose, because it wants you to watch how differently they run. Now, look at what happens in Cain's line, because it is a portrait of a civilization racing ahead and rotting at the same time. Cain builds the first city. His descendants invent things, real, impressive things. One is the father of everyone who lives in tents and keeps livestock. One is the father of everyone who plays the harp and the flute, the first musician. One forges tools out of bronze and iron, the first metal worker. Cain's family gives the world cities, music, and technology. On paper it looks like progress, like the winners. But watch where that line ends. It ends with a man named Lamech, Cain's descendant, who stands up in front of his two wives and sings the first poem recorded in the Bible. And what is the poem about? It is a boast about murder. Lamech brags that he has killed a young man for wounding him and declares that if Cain is avenged 7 times, then he, Lamech, will be avenged 77 times. The line of Cain begins with one murder and ends generations later with a man singing proudly about another one and multiplying the violence by 11. So Cain's branch gives you the invention of culture and the escalation of bloodshed at the same time, and then it just stops. It goes no further. The genealogy of the murderer runs down to Lamech's boast and simply dead ends there, as if the text is telling you this whole line has reached the end of where it can go. And then chapter 5 begins and starts the human story over again, this time through Seth. But before we walk down Seth's line, I have to show you the strangest thing about these two family trees, the detail that has made careful readers stare for centuries. Put the two lists side by side and read the names, and you start to feel like you are seeing double. In Cain's line, one of the names is Enoch. In Seth's line, there is also an Enoch. In Cain's line, there is a man named Irad, then Mehujael, then Methushael, then Lamech. In Seth's line, you get names that sound almost like echoes of those: Jared, Mahalalel, Methuselah, and then, at the end, another Lamech. Both lines contain an Enoch. Both lines end in a Lamech. The names rhyme and overlap across the two family trees in a way that is far too tight to be random. It is as if Seth's line is a mirror of Cain's line, running the same sounds through a completely different destiny. And here is why that matters, because the two men who share those names could not end up more differently. And that is the entire point the text is making. Take the two men named Enoch. Cain's Enoch is just a name, a city named after him, and nothing more, a monument to a man who built something out of stone. But Seth's Enoch is one of the most astonishing figures in the whole Bible. Of Seth's Enoch, the text says something it says about almost no one else. It says Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, because God took him. Enoch, in Seth's line, does not die like everyone else in the chapter. The genealogy of chapter 5 is a drumbeat of death. This man lived so many years and he died. This man lived so many years and he died, over and over. And right in the middle of that drumbeat, one man breaks the pattern. Enoch walked with God, and instead of dying, he was simply taken. Same name as a man in Cain's line, opposite ending entirely. Now do the same with the two men named Lamech, and the contrast is even sharper. Cain's Lamech, we already saw, stands up and sings a song bragging about killing a man. Seth's Lamech does something completely opposite. Seth's Lamech becomes the father of Noah, and when his son is born, he speaks a prophecy of hope. He says this child will bring us comfort, relief from our work, and from the painful toil of our hands, because of the ground the Lord has cursed. One Lamech sings about spilling blood. The other Lamech prays over a newborn for the whole world to be comforted. And the son that second Lamech names in hope, Noah, is the man God will use to save the human race from the flood. The two lines are running the same names on purpose, so that you will feel, in your bones, the difference between the branch that ends in a boast about death and the branch that ends in a baby who carries rescue. So the doubled names are not sloppy record-keeping. They are the text's way of holding up two possible destinies for the human race, side by side, using the same handful of sounds. Cain's line takes the names toward violence, toward the city, toward the dead end. Seth's line takes the very same names toward walking with God, toward prophecy, toward Noah and survival. And that is the deeper answer to why Seth is the one you descend from and not Cain. This is not just Cain's line happening to fade on its own. The whole book is drawing a fork in the road, two families from one father, and telling you which branch carries the future. The murderer's line invents the world. The forgotten son's line carries the promise. And that word, promise, is not decoration, because there is a thread running underneath all of this that most people never connect to Seth at all. Go back to the garden, to the moment right after Adam and Eve fall, when God is speaking judgment over the serpent. In the middle of that curse, God says something strange and enormous. He tells the serpent that he will put enmity between the serpent and the woman, and between the serpent's seed and her seed, and that her seed, her offspring, will one day crush the serpent's head. It is the first promise of a rescuer in the entire Bible, spoken over the woman's seed, her line of descendants. And then Cain, the first seed, turns out to be a murderer, and Abel, the next hope, is killed. The promised line looks dead before it starts, until Eve holds a third son and says, "God has appointed me another seed." That exact word, seed. The forgotten son arrives carrying the same word God used in the garden for the one who would crush the serpent. Which raises a question we are going to chase all the way to the end of this video. If the rescuer was promised through the woman's seed, and the seed line runs through Seth, then where exactly does Seth's family tree finally lead? Here is the payoff the boring genealogy has been quietly building toward, and it is the reason the whole Bible needed Seth. Follow Seth's line the way chapter 5 lays it out. Seth has Enosh. Enosh has Kenan. Kenan has Mahalalel, then Jared, then Enoch, the one who walked with God, then Methuselah, the oldest man in the Bible, who lives 969 years, then Lamech, and then Noah. 10 generations from Adam through Seth, down to the man who builds the ark. Every human being who survives the flood, Noah and his 3 sons and their wives, comes down through Seth, which means the entire human race after the flood, everyone on the planet from that point forward, is not just descended from Adam. They are descended from Adam specifically through Seth. Cain's whole line, the city builders and the metal workers and the singer of the murder song, is wiped from the earth in the flood. Only Seth's branch comes through the water. The forgotten son is the only one of Adam's children whose family survives at all. Hold that for a moment, because it quietly rewrites the family tree of the entire species. When people say we are all children of Adam, that is true, but it is not specific enough. After the flood, we are all children of Seth. Every nation, every king, every prophet, every person you have ever met runs back up the line to the third son of Adam, the replacement child, the one born into Abel's empty place. Abel died with no children. Cain's line drowned. The whole future of humanity funneled down through the one brother the retellings forget to mention. But the genealogy does not stop at Noah. And this is where it becomes something far bigger than ancient history, because the New Testament picks the line back up. In the Gospel of Luke, when the writer wants to show you exactly who Jesus is, he traces his family tree backward, generation by generation, all the way to the beginning. And listen to how that genealogy ends, because it runs straight through the man we are talking about. It goes back through David, back through Abraham, back through Noah, and then it keeps going, up the very list from Genesis 5. Luke writes that Jesus was the son, so it was thought, of Joseph, and on up the line until the final few names: the son of Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. Read those names again and feel what the New Testament just did. It puts Seth, the forgotten third son, directly into the family tree of Jesus. Seth is not a footnote in the line of the Messiah, he is a load-bearing link in it. The promise in the garden was that the woman's seed would one day crush the serpent. That seed, Eve said, was appointed in Seth, and the New Testament traces that seed, name by name, from Seth through the whole Old Testament, and lands it on Jesus. The rescuer promised over the woman in the garden comes down, in the Bible's own genealogy, through the son that Eve held in her grief and named for the child she had lost. The empty place Abel left is the exact place the line of the Messiah begins. And that, right there, the forgotten son turning out to be the hinge the whole promise swings on, is the entire reason this channel exists. If you want more of these threads that the quick retellings leave lying on the floor, take 1 second and subscribe. It genuinely helps these deeper readings reach the people who would actually want them. And there is a second thread we have not finished pulling, because the image runs down this very same line. We saw that the likeness of God was handed from Adam to Seth, father to son, the first time the text ever traces it passing on. Now follow that image down the road Luke follows, generation after generation, and watch where it ends. The New Testament calls Jesus the very image of the invisible God, the exact imprint of his nature. So the stamp that started on Adam and was handed first to Seth travels the entire length of the forgotten son's line and comes to rest on the one person the New Testament says is the image of God in full. The branch nobody remembers is the branch the likeness of God was carried down. Cain built a city that drowned. Seth carried something you cannot drown. Think about the shape of that. Cain, the firstborn, the one everyone remembers, is a dead end in every sense. He kills, he is exiled, his line drowns, and he is nowhere in the family of the promise. Seth, the one nobody remembers, is where the whole thing runs through. The Bible keeps doing this over and over, choosing the overlooked one, the younger one, the replacement, the one the world would skip. And it starts here in the 4th chapter of Genesis, with a mother naming a baby after a loss, having no idea that the line she just started would run unbroken for thousands of years, all the way to Bethlehem. But I have to complicate the neat picture, because the story of Seth's line is not all light, and the honesty is the point. We have been talking about Seth's descendants as the good line, the godly branch, the one that carries the promise, and that is the reputation they have. But something goes wrong in that line too, and it goes wrong in a way that may be the actual reason God decides to flood the entire world. Because between the sunny genealogy of chapter 5 and the ark of chapter 6, there are 4 of the strangest verses in the whole Bible, and an ancient reading of them puts the blame for the flood squarely on the descendants of Seth. Here is the setup. Chapter 6 of Genesis opens by saying that as human beings multiplied on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took as wives any they chose. And then it tells us that in those days there were giants, or fallen ones, on the earth, and that the whole world became so violent and corrupt that God resolved to wipe it clean with a flood. It is a dark, compressed, almost mythic passage, and it hinges on one phrase nobody can fully agree on. Who are the sons of God? Because depending on who those beings are, the flood has a completely different cause. And one of the oldest answers points straight back at the family we have been following this whole video. There are 3 main ways people have read that phrase, sons of God. And I am not going to pretend it is settled, because it genuinely is not. But one of them is the reason we are talking about it in a video about Seth. The first reading is that the sons of God are angels, heavenly beings who crossed a line they were never meant to cross and took human women, producing a race of giants. The second is that they were human rulers, kings and tyrants, who seized whatever women they wanted by force. And the third reading, one of the oldest and most influential in the history of the church, is that the sons of God are the line of Seth. On this reading, the sons of God are the godly descendants of Seth, the worshipping line, the family where people first called on the name of the Lord, and the daughters of men are the descendants of Cain, the worldly line, the city builders. And the catastrophe of chapter 6 is what happens when those 2 lines, kept separate for generations, finally mix. Follow the logic because it is genuinely gripping. In this reading, Seth's line had stayed faithful. They were the ones who walked with God, the ones Enoch came from, the branch that kept the worship alive on one side, while Cain's line raced ahead into violence and invention on the other. And then, generation by generation, the wall between them comes down. The sons of the godly line look at the daughters of the worldly line, and they see that they are beautiful, and they marry across the divide, and the faithful line is slowly swallowed into the corruption of the other. The salt loses its savor. The one branch that was holding the human race together spiritually dissolves into the branch that was falling apart. And when the last godly line is gone, when there is no separation left, the whole earth tips into the violence that makes God send the flood. In this telling, the flood has nothing to do with monsters falling out of the sky. It comes from the failure of Seth's own children to stay who they were. And there is something almost unbearably human in that version of the disaster, because it is not evil crashing in from the outside, but good people slowly, quietly, generation by generation, forgetting who they were. Nobody in this reading wakes up one morning and decides to end the world. The sons of Seth simply stop guarding the line. They marry where it is easy instead of where it is faithful, and every single step looks harmless on its own, the way compromise always does. And by the time anyone can see the damage, there is no faithful branch left to hold the world steady. The flood in this telling is what a whole civilization looks like when its last good line finally blends into everything around it, one reasonable choice at a time. And there is an ancient book that tells this exact story in vivid, almost cinematic detail, and it is worth knowing about, as long as we are honest about what it is. It is a Syriac Christian text called the Cave of Treasures, and it imagines the geography of all this quite literally. It says the descendants of Seth lived up on a holy mountain, close to the edge of the lost paradise, in purity and worship, and that they were called the children of God because of how they lived. And Cain's descendants lived down below in the valley, where they had invented music and pleasure and every kind of indulgence. And the Cave of Treasures tells how the sound of that music drifted up the mountain, and how, one by one, the sons of Seth went down to it and could not come back, seduced off the holy mountain by the beauty and the songs of the daughters of Cain, until the pure line was empty and the flood became inevitable. It is a haunting image, the faithful slowly walking down off the mountain toward the music, and never climbing back up. Now I want to be clear and careful, the way I always try to be here. The Cave of Treasures is a much later text, and the Sethite reading of Genesis 6, while very old and held by serious people like the Church Father Augustine, is one interpretation among three, not the plain, settled meaning of the verses. The Bible itself does not say in so many words that the sons of God are Seth's line. That is a reading, a way of making sense of a famously difficult passage, and other faithful readers land on the angels or the rulers instead. If you want the deep dive into who these beings really were, and into the giants, the Nephilim, that the passage says came from them, we have a whole separate video on this channel that pulls that thread all the way, and I will point you to it at the end. For today, what matters is simply this. In one of the most ancient and widespread readings of the flood, the great question of the story is not what the monsters did. It is whether Seth's children would stay faithful. The forgotten son's family is placed at the very center of the world's greatest judgment. But if you think that is the strangest thing the ancient world believed about Seth's line, wait until you hear what they said his children built to survive the end of the world. That detail comes from the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, and it shows you just how large this forgotten family loomed in the imagination of the ancient world. Josephus, writing in the 1st century, says the children of Seth were the inventors of a very particular kind of wisdom. He says they discovered the order of the heavens, the movements of the stars and the sun and the moon, the beginnings of what we would call astronomy. And then he tells a story that has fascinated people for 2,000 years. He says that Seth's descendants had heard a prophecy that the world would be destroyed twice, once by fire and once by water. And so, to preserve everything they had learned about the heavens, they built 2 great pillars, one out of brick and one out of stone. The brick pillar would survive a flood. The stone pillar would survive a fire. On these pillars in this ancient tradition, they carved their knowledge so that no matter which catastrophe came, the wisdom of Seth's line would not be lost. And Josephus adds a striking line. He says the stone pillar still stood in his own day, in the land of Syriad, in his time, that people could still go and see it. Whether or not any such pillars ever existed, and there is no reason to think they literally did, weigh what that legend is telling you about how Seth was remembered. This is not the profile of a forgotten nobody. In the ancient imagination, Seth's line were the first scientists, the first astronomers, the keepers of a wisdom so precious they engineered it to survive the end of the world twice over. The son the modern retelling reduces to a single verse was, to the ancient world, the head of the wise and righteous branch of humanity, the ones who watched the stars and tried to save what they knew from the coming judgment. And that is the strange thing about Seth. The more you dig, the bigger he gets, and the further his name travels, until it ends up somewhere you would never expect a forgotten Bible character to go. Here is how far the name of the forgotten son actually traveled, because it did not stay a footnote in Genesis. It became the center of entire religious movements you have probably never connected to him. In the first centuries after Christ, there was a whole family of groups that historians now call the Sethians, and they took Seth and made him something enormous. To them, Seth was not just a son of Adam. He was a heavenly figure, a bringer of secret knowledge, the spiritual ancestor of a special race of enlightened human beings. When the Nag Hammadi library, a collection of ancient texts, was found buried in Egypt in the last century, some of the writings in it turned out to be Sethian scriptures, with titles that name him directly, treating Seth as a savior figure and the source of a hidden wisdom passed down to his true children. A minor character in Genesis, a man given one verse and a genealogy, became the founding hero of an entire mystical system. And it did not stop with them. In Islam, Seth is remembered too under the name Shith, and in Islamic tradition he is honored as a prophet, one who received scriptures of his own and carried the knowledge of his father Adam forward to the next generation. So across three different religious worlds, Jewish tradition, breakaway Christian movements, and Islam, the same forgotten third son keeps reappearing, each time treated as a keeper of wisdom, a carrier of the line, a figure far larger than the single sentence your Bible seems to give him. The man the Sunday school version skips over turns out to be one of the most quietly influential names in the entire ancient world. And yet, for all of that, when you go back to the Bible itself and ask how Seth's own life ends, the text does the same thing to him that it did to his wife. It gives you almost nothing. It tells you Seth lived 912 years, and then it says 4 small words that fall on every name in the chapter like a hammer. And he died. That is his ending. No deathbed scene, no famous last words, no grave we can point to, no drama at all. The man who carried the line of the promise, whose descendants filled the earth and reached to Jesus, gets the same flat epitaph as everyone else. He lived, he had sons and daughters, and he died. The most important quiet man in the Bible slips off the page as softly as he came onto it. So the questions we started with finally have their answers. And when you lay them all out, the third son everyone forgets stops being an afterthought and becomes one of the most important names in the whole book. Let's bring it home. We started with 2 brothers everyone knows, Cain and Abel, and a third name that gets dropped in and forgotten, Seth. And when we followed the forgotten son, instead of skipping him, the whole first family cracked open. Where did Seth's wife come from? From the only place she could, the daughters of Adam and Eve, a sister or a niece the Bible would not name, though an ancient book reached in and called her Azura. Who was Seth? The replacement child, born into a murdered brother's empty place, the son whose family first called on the name of God. And what happened to his line? It became the mirror of Cain's line, the same names running toward the opposite destiny, and it carried the promise of the woman's seed down through Noah, through the whole Old Testament, all the way to a genealogy that ends son of Seth, son of Adam, son of God. The forgotten brother is the branch we all came down. He is the line the rescuer came through. He is the reason the empty place did not stay empty. But here is the part I actually cannot stop thinking about, and it is not about the genealogies, it is about the empty chair. Seth was born because someone was missing. His mother held him with the grief of a buried son still fresh, and she named the new baby for the hole the old one left. He spent his whole life standing in a place that was shaped like a loss. And out of that place, that ache, that appointed second chance, came everything. The worship, the line, the promise. The whole future of the human race grew out of a seat at the fire that used to belong to someone else. And if you have ever felt like the replacement, the afterthought, the one who came second, the one nobody tells the story about, Seth is in the Bible to tell you that the quiet ones standing in the empty places are very often the ones carrying the whole thing forward. The world remembers the brother who made the noise. Heaven built its promise on the one who simply stayed and worshipped and had children and carried the line no one was watching. That is the whole reason this channel exists, to open the book back up and read the skipped-over names, where the truth turns out to be closer to your own life than anyone told you. If this changed how you see even one verse, subscribe, because there is a thread we left hanging tonight. We said the flood may have come because Seth's own faithful line finally gave way, and we mentioned the sons of God, and the giants the Bible says came from them. Who those beings really were and what the Nephilim actually were is one of the strangest mysteries in all of Scripture, and that video is on screen right now. I think you'll want to know how the Forgotten Son's story turns dark,